In today's episode, the wand that was broken has been reforged. So, stay tuned. What up, fam? Welcome to the Skill Tree, where we learn how to do just about everything. So if you follow this channel, you know that I have a couple of different costume builds going on. One of which is my epic War Mage, which I made this dope leather hood for. And I am super excited about today's build because we've made his wand. Okay, look at this thing. I loves it. It is made from wood that I sourced from my backyard, resin, leather, wire, and it glows. It's so cool. All right, I couldn't be more excited to show you this build, so let's just jump right into it and level up these skills. Making the wand. Okay, so to make this, hold on a second. If I'm gonna be a nerd, I'm gonna go full nerd. Badass thing. I love this thing, though I'm still wearing my khakis and sweater from work, so I'm War Mage casual today. All right, so to begin with, we're gonna make the whole wooden portion of this wand here. Now this is made out of oak, and you could, of course, just go pick up some lumber from your local hardware store or whatever. That being said, I'm cheap, I have a forest behind my house, and I have some wood that I've set aside for projects. The problem is I'm in New England, it is February, and the dead of winter. But this would not stop the War Mage. So I bundled up, trudged outside, and cut me some wood. The problem with this, though, is it was wet, frozen, and nasty. Again, undeterred, I whipped out this wire brush and just started cleaning all of the gunk off of it. Once all that extra crap was removed off of it, I needed to figure out what length I actually wanted this wand to be. Now, the design is based off of this artwork by Middle Mist Red. So I just went ahead and printed this out to size so I can have a basis for my measurements and also a template to actually cut from. I also used it to figure out where on this piece of wood it would fit best. And it actually kind of worked out because that section I had this kind of bend to it already, so it fit really nicely right in the space I wanted it to go in. With that all figured out, I just went ahead and cut it to size. Then, using a draw knife, I removed all of the bark so I had kind of a clean starting ground. I also got rid of any other protrusions or just anything that was in the way. All right, so the next step here, I needed a flat surface to start working with. To make this happen, I just used a rasp to kind of get it started. Then I made a bunch of passes with my hand planer, just flattening it out as much as I could and making sure I had a big enough working surface to fit my template onto. Speaking of the template, once that flat surface was prepared, I went ahead and used an X-Acto knife and cut out the shape of my wand from the paper. Then I again placed it on that limb just to make sure I liked where the fit would go. Happy with that, I hit the back of my template with some contact adhesive, and then carefully placed it onto my prepared oak. Alright, I'm gonna level with you here. I've never wanted to have a bandsaw available as badly as I did during this project. Not having a bandsaw at my disposal, I was forced to use a jigsaw to cut this shape out. Now this is mostly me just whining. It was doable with the jigsaw, but it was hard. This was kind of like frozen wet oak, and it did not want to cut. I got there in the end and I managed to rough out the shape. I mean, if you don't have the right tools, you can do the thing. It's just significantly harder. But once it was roughed out, I was able to use my belt sander and really start to hone in that shape closer to what my template was showing. So at this point, the general outline of the wand was right, but if you turned it on its side, it was still this big giant chunk of wood. So I just went ahead and drew in that taper from the top. Then busted out a handsaw and just cut along my lines. And again, a bandsaw would have been really sweet. Alright, so as I mentioned, when I brought this wood in, it was pretty much frozen solid, and though it isn't frozen at this point, it was still really wet. So I just set it in front of my little space heater here for the night and let it do its thing. Now, usually you'd really want to dry out the wood before you started cutting into it and shaping it or whatever, because while it dries, it can warp or crack, especially once you've already removed a lot of the other meat and have kind of a thin piece, right? And this is exactly what happened. I had cracks running up the back, cracks running down the bottom, but you're gonna see that because of the nature of this particular build, I didn't care. In fact, I wanted more cracks to show up. You'll see why as we go along, but I promise, it was part of the plan. I can feel woodworkers yelling at me in the comments section before they reach this part. Cool, so once it was dry, I brought it over my sander and started really kind of refining that shape. Rounding out all of the edges, giving little indents where I wanted them. Just in general, trying to make the best wand I could with the wood that I had. And I loved how it came out. At that point, if I just stained it and sealed it or whatever, I would have been over the moon with that wand. It was already really nice. Anyways, my excitement over the wand quickly died. Because the next step was really hard to do. Building character. So they say all of the troubles and stuff you go through in your life is what builds your character, makes you who you are. If that's true, our wand is about to get a whole bunch of character. It's gonna be broken, cut, burned. I am gonna destroy everything we just worked hard on. So an inspiration for a lot of this wand are those like hidden wood pendants. I love the look of those things and the fact that you can kind of peek inside of the resin there and you see the broken wood, and it's a really neat look. To try to achieve this, I took a pencil and I marked the areas that I wanted the break to happen. Then using my saw, I made shallow cuts all along those lines. Basically, you want to cut enough to weaken the wood, but not all the way through. This way, when you do finally snap it, you're left with all these splintery, gnarly pieces in the middle, and it makes it look like a natural break rather than a cut. Now to make it look even more natural, I needed to get rid of those really straight saw cuts. So to do this, I busted out my Dremel with a sanding drum on it and just started rounding out those edges. I also started extending little grooves from those edges to make it all craggly and whatnot on the sides. Alright, so in my head, this like super legendary wand was used in a great battle and so much power went through it that it exploded. Then our mage friend found the shattered bits of it and used magic to reforge it again. So as evidence of that, I wanted like little lightning bolts and stuff coming up from like the solidified magic that's holding everything together. So to that end, I put a cutting bit on the Dremel and I started making all these little lightning bolts extending out of those grooves that I cut in with my sander. Because the little cutter on the Dremel likes to grab onto a grain and kind of go a little bit out of my control, all these little lightning bolt tendrils came out really natural looking. It's like one of those happy accidents that Bob Ross talks about. All right, at this point, even though it's a little early to do so, I wanted to add color to all the wood because I was afraid it would get locked underneath some of this resin and be like a lighter color underneath than all the rest of it. But this thing is to be epic. We can't use basic stain. No. Today we paint with fire. Using my blowtorch, I just blackened all of the edges where the resin would sit. And again, in this wand's like backstory, so much power went through it that it burst apart. So I want those edges to be really kind of burned and gnarly, like it burned itself out. And once I was happy with those ends, I went back over the rest of it with the torch, letting the fire linger longer on areas that I wanted to be darker. If you've never stained wood with fire before, I highly recommend you give it a try. Be careful because, you know, wood and fire. But the outcome is always really interesting. Like no two pieces of wood ever take the fire the same and certain pieces of grain pop more than others. It's got a really natural and interesting look to it. All right, at this point, our poor wand has been through enough. Its trial by fire is over and we can move on to Resin Reforge. Okay, in this step, we're gonna take those two pieces of the wand and put it all back together again. Now to do this, we're gonna be using one of my new favorite toys, UV resin. I did a whole video on this stuff right here if you want to check that out. The nuts and bolts of it is it's a resin that cures in just a couple of minutes under UV light. Now the resin I have is clear, but you can buy these awesome little dyes and make it whatever color you want. And for this build to match my War Mage, I was going for a nice deep blue. So I just went ahead and added a couple of drops of the blue dye to it and gave it a good mix. Now if you know me and you've been following the show for any amount of time, you know that I cannot resist making things glow in the dark too. Everybody has their kink, what can I say? To do this, I have this glow-in-the-dark powder from Art & Glow that is specifically made to be added to resins. It's the same exact stuff I used to make my little glowy snowflakes during the holidays. And just a little bit goes a long way with this stuff. Also, if you do want to add that stuff, just be aware that it tends to make your resin opaque, so don't use too much of it if you don't have to. Alright, so with that small resin mixture already, I used a paintbrush and started filling in all my little lightning bolts. Then I simply used the UV light and hardened them into place. Now because I knew I was going to go back in and sand everything down, I wasn't particularly careful with this. I just made sure it got into all the cracks where I needed it to be and then hardened it. I also went ahead and filled in any other cracks that naturally formed inside of the wood, like during the drying process or whatever, just so whenever you look at it and you find a crack, it looks as if this blue energy is just the core of this wand. It's what it's made out of. See that? The cracks were all part of the plan all along, like an evil genius. Okay, so with those lightning bits all hardened and looking sexy, it was time to finally put the wand back together with this big chunk of resin in the middle. And you start by putting it together the way you put anything together, with a whole bunch of tape. The basics of this is we're going to use that tape to form the mold to pour more resin into. Now, if you're using a UV resin like I did rather than a 2-part resin, you need to make sure you use clear tape, like a packing tape or something, so that the light can penetrate through and actually harden it. And once I had my cylinder O tape into place, I busted out some clay and smoothed them along the edge of the tape just to make a good seal so that none of this resin escapes and drips out. Now, to actually be able to get my resin inside of there, I just took an X-Acto knife and I cut a little tiny hole in the top. Oh, and it probably goes without saying, but make sure that when you tape them together or whatever, it's in the position that you want it to be in. Like, you don't want resin in this thing where it's at a 90 or it's twisted funny or whatever. All right, with that prepped and ready, I went ahead and put some more resin in a cup and added the dye and the glow mix and all that good stuff. And to actually get that resin inside of my mold, I bought this cheap syringe from the drugstore. This way I'm not just trying to free pour it, I can actually fill up the resin exactly where I need it. Now, to make sure I had enough in there, I filled it up until it started to overflow, and I also wanted to try to get rid of some air bubbles. And this is where I think a 2-part epoxy might have been a better choice. I don't know if it's just how fast this seals or whatever, but I did get a good amount of air bubbles inside of here. It doesn't detract from the build at all. If anything, it actually looks kinda cool. But just something to keep in mind if you're looking for like perfectly bubble-free resin. All right, so with that ready, it's time to harden it. Now, because this hardens with UV light, I put it on top of a mirror just so the light would kind of bounce back and forth a little bit. I don't know if this actually helps. In my head, it made sense, so it's what I did. But also because I'm lazy and I didn't want to stand there with the UV light, I went ahead and set up a little stand with a grate on top of it so I can just leave the flashlight to do its thing. Then at this point, I just walked away from it and cleaned up my shop for like 10 minutes. That's one of the things I like most about this resin. It cures so fast under a UV light, but when you want it to. Like, there are plenty of resins that cure really quickly, but you have a pot time that you're working with, and if something goes wrong, that pot time keeps ticking, and it's curing as you go. This stuff, though, just kind of stays in its liquid form until it's exposed to UV light. It's awesome. And yeah, once that 10 minutes or so was up, I just kind of removed the tape, and damn, there was resin. It wasn't attractive at this point, but it was there. It was pretty cool. I think it's cool. I then did the same thing with the tip, just wrapping a little cone of tape around it, filling it up with resin, and then shining a light on it until it cures. It's just such a stupid easy way to make a really cool effect. I could see somebody using that effect and just kind of carving it so it looked like a gem or something, right? Like, that's really cool. Now for the butt of the wand here, I went in with my Dremel and just cut an interesting shaped groove into it. You know, just a place that's deeper than the surface of the wood for the resin to sit into. Then again, I surrounded it with tape, sealed it in with some clay, and filled that bad boy up before exposing it to some UV light to harden. Now, my initial thought going into this was like, okay, cool, we can get the resin into place, but shaping it's probably going to be difficult. I was wrong. This stuff sands easier than wood does. It was a breeze just to get it down to the exact shapes I was looking for. And then once I did have that into shape, I started sanding everything as if it was one piece. Moving from 60 grit sandpaper all the way up to 7,000 grit sandpaper. And this bit, though time consuming, is so worth it. Look at how shiny that is. And because I did it all as one, like the wood and the plastic as well, that you can't see any spot where one ends and one begins. They're all like the same amount of shininess, and the transitions between them is just, it's so good. God, I love this thing. All right, at this point, it is reforged. It is a wand. Now, let's wrap this thing up with a few finishing touches. All right, it's wood, so I obviously wanted to add protection to this whole thing, but I didn't want to use a polyurethane because I wasn't sure if that would kind of muddy up the way the plastic looks. So instead, I busted out some of this True Oil. This is the stuff that's commonly used on like gun stocks. All you gotta do is rub a good amount on, let it dry for a few hours, and then buff it to get a beautiful shine. And the more coats of this stuff you add with some like sanding in between, the shinier it gets. So just kind of go to town with it. All right, so now to sexy up this handle and the tip here a little bit, I decided to use a piece from the same kind of leather that my hood is made out of. You know, as if the mage made it specifically for himself. To do this, I just cut a strip of that leather about 1/2 inch wide. I also needed just a little bit of this wax thread. So I started by laying that strip of leather flesh side up across the top of the handle. We're basically gonna use it to wrap around itself so that it locks that end into place. Next, I make a little loop out of that piece of thread and position it along the bottom. Now I just neatly wrap that leather around everything as tightly as I can. Now when I got to the end of the wrap, I just needed to cut the wrapping at a diagonal so that it would die back into itself and make a nice clean line. To do this, I simply marked where it needed to go and then cut it with my cutting wheel. Then I used some barge cement contact adhesive to lock it into place. Next, I busted out this spool of jeweler's wire. To put this in place and make this cool little wrap here, I just stabbed a little piece of that wire underneath the leather and then just started wrapping the wire just before the leather starts. Once I was happy with that, I just continued that wire following the spiral of the leather. This kind of gives it a cool look, like the wire is inset into the leather a little bit. Then when I reached the end, I kept wrapping it around the back of the leather so that it matched the front. Now once I was happy with that, I passed the wire through my thread loop and then pulled the other end, making the wire go underneath the leather and locking everything into place. And then just cut off any of the excess. Now, I was making this up a little bit as I went along, and I love how it came out. Like, in my head, the magic of this one is kind of like lightning energy. So having these little metal coils around it kind of makes sense in my dome piece, and I love it. To jazz up the tip here, I just did the same thing. I made a tiny little loop out of leather and put a thread behind it. Then I wrapped my wire around it, passed it through my thread, and then pulled the thread back to lock it into place. Check this out! You cannot tell me that thing isn't dope. It went from a gnarly branch from the woods in the snow into this dope wand. This is incredible. Again, I feel like I get really like pat yourself on the back from the project that you did, but come on, this thing is awesome. I was on a podcast recently called Because We Make. Definitely check that out. But at one point, I was talking to the guys about how like sometimes you make a thing and you almost don't feel like you made it. Like you come back and you look at it and you go, that's awesome. Like somebody else did it because it doesn't feel like you were the one who did it. And that's one of the most fun parts about tackling projects like this, or something that you don't really know what you're doing on, because sometimes, often actually, you really surprise yourself. And this is one of those things. I am over the moon with how this came out. And check this out. Yes, it is beautiful, but look at it in the dark. Oh, that is so cool. It glows so brightly. And that's cloudy winter day charged in the sun. Imagine in the summertime when it's had a day worth of just sitting in the sun in my window. Oh, it's gonna be so cool. Sorry, I love this thing. I hope you love it too, or you're at least entertained by my shenanigans. If you did like what you see, why don't you consider giving me some of that thumbs up love, and don't forget to subscribe so you know when I release new content. Now I wanted to give a special shout out to Black Knight 77, our newest high tier Patreon. Black Knight 77, thank you so much for your support. It honestly means the world to me. The only way I'm able to do stuff like this and learn all these cool new things is because of my patrons and their generosity, and it blows my mind all the time that they're willing to give to this and help this channel grow. So thank all of you. I really do appreciate you. If you'd like to support what we do here, maybe consider joining as well. Details down in the description below. Finally, if there's anything you'd like to see me cover, why don't you leave it down in the comments section and I will add it to the list. Alright, well I should get going. For my power only grows stronger. Why fight a war for a kingdom when you can rule it? In the meantime, keep leveling up, you. And then carefully stuck it in my place.